You don't expect the person you gave your whole life to be the one who tells you to leave. Not like that. Not with anger in their voice. Not with a threat that shakes your entire world. Get out or I'll call the cops. Those were the words that broke her, not because they were loud, but because they came from the one person she would have never imagined hearing them from, her daughter. The same little girl she once held in her arms, the same child she stayed up all night for when she was sick, the same child she sacrificed everything for, without ever asking for anything in return, and yet, in that moment, she was no longer a mother, she was an outsider. Unwanted, unwelcome, replaceable. This is the true story of a woman. From California, a grandmother, a mother, a woman who believed love meant sacrifice until one day, she realized something that changed her life forever. Because sometimes the people you give everything to are the ones who teach you the hardest truth. And if you stay with this story until the end, you might discover a truth about your own life that you've been avoiding for far too long. Her name was Helen. 70 years old. Soft-spoken. Kind-hearted. The kind of woman who always put others before herself. She lived most of her life doing one thing: taking care of people, first her parents, then her husband, then her children, and somewhere along the way, she stopped taking care of herself. Helen wasn't always alone. There was a time when her home was full of laughter, full of noise, full of life. Her husband, Mark, was a hard-working man. Not perfect, but dependable. They built their life together slowly, step by step, dollar by dollar. They didn't have much in the beginning, but they had each other, and they had a dream. A better life for their children. Helen worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs. She skipped things she wanted, so her kids could have things they needed. New clothes, school trips, opportunities she never had growing up, and she never complained. Not once, because to her that was love. Love meant sacrifice. Love meant giving. Love meant putting yourself last. Her daughter Sarah was her pride, her joy, her heart. Helen remembered the first time Sarah called her mom. The first day of school. The tears. The hugs. The late-night talks. She remembered everything. Every small moment that built a lifetime of love. But life doesn't always move in straight lines. It shifts, it changes, and sometimes, it quietly drifts apart without you even realizing it. After her husband passed away, everything began to feel different. The house became quieter. The days became longer, and the nights became the hardest. That's when Sarah suggested something. "Mom, why don't you come? Stay with me for a while." Helen hesitated. She didn't want to be a burden, but Sarah insisted. "It'll be good for you." And for a moment, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted important, so she packed her things, left behind the house filled with memories, and moved in with her daughter first. Everything seemed perfect. Sarah was kind, welcoming, supportive. Helen helped around the house, cooked meals, cleaned, watched her grandchildren. She tried to make herself useful, because deep down, she believed something she had believed her entire life, that if I'm useful, I'm loved. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly, something began to change. Not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly, subtly. Like a shift in the air that you can't explain but you can feel. Sarah became distant, short-tempered, irritated over small things. "Mom, you don't have to do everything. Mom, just relax. Mom, you're doing too much." But Helen didn't understand doing things, helping. That's how she showed love, that's how she felt valued, so she kept trying. Kept giving. Kept adjusting herself to fit into a space that was slowly pushing her out. Then came the small comments. "You're always in the way. You don't understand how things work now. You should rest more, you're not young anymore." Each sentence, small on its own, but together, they began to break something inside her. Helen started questioning herself. Maybe I am too much. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I've outlived my place. And that's the dangerous part. Because when you start believing you're a burden, you begin shrinking yourself. You speak less. You do less. You exist less. Until one day you barely recognize yourself anymore. Helen stopped sitting in the living room. She stayed in her room more often, quiet, careful. Trying not to disturb anything. Trying not to take up space. Trying not to become a problem. But no matter how small she made herself, it was never enough. Because the problem wasn't her presence, it was something deeper. Something unspoken. Something building beneath the surface. And then one evening, everything changed. It started with something small, dinner. Just a normal evening, a simple conversation, but sometimes, the smallest moments turn into the biggest breaking points. And that night, a few words turned into something Helen would never forget. Something that would force her to make a choice, a painful one, a necessary one, a life-changing one, because sometimes, the moment that breaks you is the same moment that wakes you up. Dinner that night felt different. Not because of what was said at first, but because of what wasn't. The table was set, plates placed neatly. The smell of food filled the kitchen. Everything looked normal. But something in the air felt heavy. Unspoken tension. The kind you can feel, even when no one says a word. Helen stood quietly near the stove, finishing the last touches. She had spent hours cooking Sarah's favorite dishes. The same meal she used to make when Sarah was a child, back when food wasn't just food. It was comfort. It was love. Dinner's ready, Helen said softly. Her voice carried warmth, hope. Maybe tonight would feel like before. Maybe tonight things would be different. They all sat at the table, Sarah, her husband, the kids, Helen. For a moment silence, then small talk began. School, work, daily routines, normal things. But Helen noticed something. No one really looked at her. No one asked her anything. She was there, but not really there. Like a shadow sitting at the table. Still, she smiled. She always smiled. Because that's what she had learned. Keep things light. Keep things peaceful. Don't create problems. As the dinner continued, Helen reached for a dish, her hand slightly shaky. She accidentally knocked a glass. It tipped over. Water spilled across the table. It wasn't a big mess. Something easily cleaned. But the reaction wasn't small. Sarah slammed her hand on the table. Mom! Seriously? The room went silent. Helen froze. I'm sorry. It was just an accident, she said quickly, her voice almost trembling. Sarah stood up, frustration written all over her face. This is exactly what I mean. Helen blinked. What do you mean? You're always doing something. Always in the way. The words hit harder than the sound of the glass falling. Helen felt her chest tighten. I was just trying to help. I didn't ask for help, Sarah snapped. The children went quiet. Even Sarah's husband looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything, and that silence, it made everything worse. Helen stood there, unsure of what to do, her hands slightly shaking, her heart beating faster. I just thought, Mom, please, Sarah interrupted, her voice louder now, sharper. I can't do this anymore. Those words, they didn't just hurt, they broke something. Helen felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. What are you saying? She asked softly. Sarah took a deep breath. But there was no softness left in her voice. I need space. Space. Such a simple word, but in that moment it felt like rejection. I live here too, Helen said quietly. Not in anger. Not in defiance. Just a reminder. Please. Sarah shook her head. No, Mom. This is my house. Each word was like a door closing slowly, firmly, final. Helen looked around the room. The table. The walls. The place she thought had become her home. And suddenly, it didn't feel like hers at all. I don't understand, she whispered. And that's when it happened. The moment that would stay with her forever. Sarah stepped closer. Her voice low, but filled with something Helen had never heard before. Anger, cold, controlled. Then let me make it clear. A pause, just a second, but it felt like time stopped. Get out or I'll call the cops. Silence, complete silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. Helen stared at her daughter, hoping, praying that she had heard wrong. But she hadn't. The words were real and once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. The grandchildren looked confused, scared. Sarah's husband shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent, and Helen felt something inside her collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, quietly. Like something breaking that had been holding her together for years. I'll go, she said. Her voice barely audible. No argument, no anger, just acceptance. Because when the person you love most tells you to leave, you don't fight, you don't defend, you just leave. Helen walked slowly to her room. Each step heavier than the last. She looked around at the small space she had been living in, her clothes, her belongings, the little pieces of her life. She packed quietly. No rushing, no crying, just silence, because sometimes pain goes so deep, it doesn't come out as tears. It comes out as numbness. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, paused for a moment, hoping maybe someone would stop her. Maybe someone would say, "Wait, don't go. We didn't mean it." But no one did. She opened the door, stepped outside, and just like that, she was no longer part of that home. The door closed behind her, and with it, closed a chapter of her life she never thought would end this way. The night air felt cold, colder than usual. Or maybe it was just the emptiness inside her. Helen stood there for a moment, holding her bag, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. Because when your whole life has been about others, you forget how to live for yourself. And in that moment, Helen realized something painful. She had spent her entire life building a home for others, but she never built one for herself. And now, she had nowhere to go. But what she didn't know yet was that this moment, this painful, heartbreaking moment, wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something she never expected. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to finally find yourself. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Helen stood there under a dim streetlight, holding a small bag that suddenly felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Not because of what was inside, but because of what it meant. Everything she had left of her life fit into that one bag. She looked back at the house. The same house she walked into with hope. The same door she believed would always be open for her. Now closed, and not just physically. Emotionally, completely. She waited a few seconds. Maybe the door would open again. Maybe Sarah would come running out. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." But the door stayed shut. No footsteps, no voice, no apology, just silence. And that silence said everything. Helen slowly turned away. Each step she took felt uncertain, like walking without knowing where the ground ends. Where do you go when you have nowhere to go? She didn't have an answer, so she just walked. Past houses filled with light, past windows where families were still sitting together, talking, laughing, living. And with every step, she felt more invisible, more distant from the world she once belonged to. After a while, her legs started to ache, her breathing became heavier, not just from walking, but from holding everything inside. She saw a small bench near a bus stop, old, worn out, but it was something. She sat down slowly, placed her bag beside her, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel it. The pain, the rejection, the disbelief. Her hands trembled slightly as she covered her face, and then, the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears, falling one after another. Because when your heart truly breaks, it doesn't scream. It whispers. Where did I go wrong? That question echoed in her mind, again, and again, and again. She replayed every moment, every memory, every sacrifice. Every time she chose her children over herself. Was it not enough? Did she love too much? Or did she lose herself completely in the process? The night grew colder, but Helen didn't move, because sometimes, when you're emotionally lost, you don't even have the energy to search for a way out. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. And then, something shifted. Not outside. Inside. A small thought. A quiet voice. Something she hadn't heard in years. "What about you?" Helen slowly lifted her head. "What about me?" she whispered. The question felt unfamiliar, strange, almost uncomfortable, because her entire life, she had never asked it. She had always asked, "What do they need? What can I do for them? How can I make them happy?" But never, "What do I need?" That thought stayed with her. It didn't fix the pain. It didn't erase what happened. But it did something important. It created space. Space for a new kind of thinking, a new kind of awareness. Helen wiped her tears, looked around, and for the first time that night, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. She was still here, still breathing, still alive, and maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. Maybe it was just changing. She reached into her bag, pulled out her old phone. The screen lit up faintly low. Battery, just a few % left. She scrolled through her contacts. Names from the past, people she hadn't spoken to in years, friends she lost touch with, connections she let fade. While she was busy giving her life to others, she hesitated. Should she call someone? Would anyone even answer? Would she be a burden again? That fear came back quickly, familiar, heavy, but then that same quiet voice spoke again. "You are not a burden." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She chose herself, She pressed a name that an old friend, Margaret. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Helen almost hung up, but then a voice answered. Hello. Helen froze for a second. Her voice felt stuck, but then she spoke. Margaret, it's me. Helen. A pause. And then warmth. Real warmth. Helen? Oh my goodness, are you okay? That question, simple as it was, meant everything because someone finally asked. And this time she didn't say, I'm fine. She didn't pretend. She didn't hide. Her voice broke. I don't know where to go. Silence for a moment. Not the cold silence from before, but a listening silence. And then Margaret said something that would change everything. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. No hesitation and no judgment and no questions, just care. Helen felt something she hadn't felt all night. Relief. Not because her problems were solved, but because she wasn't alone anymore. She sat there on that bench, holding on to that small thread of hope, and for the first time since she walked out of that house, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel unwanted. She didn't feel like she had nowhere to go, because sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind you that you still matter. But what Helen didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, because the hardest part wasn't leaving that house. The hardest part was rebuilding herself. Letting go of the life she once knew. Breaking the belief that her worth came from sacrifice, and learning something new. Something powerful. Something that would not only change her life, but define the rest of it. Because sometimes, rock bottom isn't where you end up, it's where you finally begin to rise. Margaret arrived faster than Helen expected. Headlights cut through the quiet street. The car slowed down and stopped right in front of the bench. Helen stood up slowly, her body still tired, her heart still heavy. The car door opened, and before Helen could say a word, Margaret stepped out and wrapped her arms around her. Tight, warm, real. And that's when something inside Helen finally broke free. Not in pain this time, but in release. Because sometimes, you don't realize how much you've been holding in until someone holds you. I've got you, Margaret whispered. 3 simple words. But they felt like home. Helen didn't say much during the drive. She just looked out the window, watching the streets pass by. Thinking about everything that had just happened. It still didn't feel real. How could one moment change everything? Margaret's house wasn't big, but it felt safe, the kind of place where you could breathe again. Helen stepped inside slowly. As if she was afraid this too might disappear. Come in, Margaret said gently. No questions tonight. Just rest. That kindness, it was different. It didn't demand anything. It didn't expect anything. It just existed. Helen sat down on the couch. Her body sank into it. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax. Not completely, not yet, but enough to feel the difference. That night's sleep didn't come easily. Memories kept returning. The dinner, the words, get out or I'll call the cops. They echoed again and again. But this time, something else echoed too. You are not a burden. Helen stared at the ceiling and slowly, she began to understand something. For years, she had been living a life based on one belief. If I give more, I will be loved more. If I sacrifice more, I will matter more. If I make myself smaller, I will be accepted. But what if that belief was wrong? What if her worth was never supposed to come from what she gave? What if it was always there? She sat up slowly, her mind clearer than it had been in years, because pain has a strange way of doing that. It forces you to see things you've been avoiding. Helen realized something powerful. She didn't lose her value that night. She only lost a place that didn't see it. And that changes everything. The next morning, sunlight filled the room, soft, gentle, warm. Helen opened her eyes. For a moment, she forgot everything, and then it came back. But this time it didn't crush her. It just reminded her. Margaret was in the kitchen making tea. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. Good morning, she said with a smile. Helen hesitated, then replied softly. Good morning. They sat together, quiet at first, but not the uncomfortable silence Helen had grown used to. This silence was different, peaceful, safe. You don't have to go back, Margaret said calmly. Helen looked up. What if I have nowhere else to go? Margaret smiled gently. Then you start from here. Start, that word felt new, fresh, unfamiliar, but also full of possibility. Days passed. Helen stayed with Margaret. At first, she still felt unsure, like she was taking up space, like she needed to earn her place, but Margaret never made her feel that way. Not once, and slowly Helen began to change. She started doing small things for herself, going on short walks, sitting in the sunlight, drinking tea without rushing. Thinking not about others but about herself. And with each passing day, she felt something returning. Her voice, her presence, her identity. She wasn't just someone's mother. She wasn't just someone's caregiver. She was Helen, a woman who had lived, loved, lost, and was still here, still standing, still capable of beginning again. One afternoon, Helen looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked. Not the tired version she had been seeing for years, but the woman behind it. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't see weakness. She saw strength, because surviving pain takes strength, walking away takes strength, starting over takes strength, and that's when she made a decision. She would not go back to being invisible. She would not go back to shrinking herself. She would not go back to believing her worth depended on others. She would live differently for herself. Not selfishly, but honestly. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a new routine. Helen started volunteering at a small community center, helping others. But this time, it felt different. She wasn't doing it to feel needed. She was doing it because she wanted to. There was no pressure and no fear, just choice. And that's the difference between losing yourself and finding yourself. One day her phone rang, a name she hadn't seen in a while. Sarah? Helen stared at the screen. Her heart didn't race like before. He didn't break, he just paused. She answered. Hello. A soft voice on the other side. Mom. A long silence followed. I'm sorry. Those words, the ones Helen had once waited for, finally came. But something had changed. They didn't fix everything. They didn't erase the pain. But they opened a door. Not the same door as before, a new one. I was overwhelmed. I didn't mean what I said, Sarah continued. Helen listened, calm, present, strong. I understand, she said gently, and she meant it. Because healing doesn't always mean forgetting. It means understanding without losing yourself again. I'd like to see you, Sarah said. Helen paused. And then she said something that showed just how much she had changed. We can meet. Not I'll come back. Not I'll return. Just, we can meet. Because now she had boundaries. And boundaries are not walls, they are self-respect. Weeks later, they met. Not as before, but as two people learning again. Slowly, carefully, honestly, and Helen didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel like she had to prove her worth, because she finally knew it. And that is the most powerful transformation of all, because the truth is, your value does not decrease based on someone's inability to see it. You are not a burden. You are not too much. You are not meant to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's comfort. You are meant to live, to grow, to take up space, to be seen, to be heard. And sometimes, life will break you in ways you never expected. But those breaks, they create openings. Openings for something new. Something real. Something stronger. So if you're listening to this right now, and you feel unappreciated, unseen, unwanted, remember this. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need approval to exist. And you don't need to lose yourself to be loved. Because the moment you choose yourself, not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth, everything begins to change. Helen thought losing her home was the end. But it wasn't. That it was the moment she finally found herself. And maybe, just maybe, this is your moment too. Not to break, but to wake up. Not to give up, but to rise. Because your story isn't over, it's just waiting for you to take the next step, so take it. Slowly, bravely, honestly, and don't look back. Because the life you deserve is the one where you finally choose yourself.